Welcome to a new video. This is going to be part of a series called Super Strategies, where we are going to take a deep look into different strategies that exist in chess. Almost every single chess book that you pick up that talks about positional play will introduce this idea of a good versus bad bishop, and in general talk about how bishops and pawn structures interact with each other. I want to go ahead and talk about this as well. Here we're going to take a very deep look into 3 games that have this concept, and we're going to try to take as much as we can from these games and learn some very instructive points from these games. Now, the first one here was a Magnus Carlsen game. Magnus Carlsen had the white pieces, and you can see his opponent did a very good job of developing this bishop in a very nice manner where it has some pretty meaningful scope, whereas this one is really in a bad position. And this all stems from the opening choice for black. You can see this sort of triangle system. If you haven't developed your bishop already outside like you do in the London system, then this bishop takes a pretty big hit. And this is exactly what happened in the game. In fact, this is actually why black ended up losing this game, for this sole reason that the bishop just couldn't develop to a meaningful square. So let's just quickly see how Magnus Carlsen took advantage of it. First, he put a piece on that square, blocking this pawn from moving, because black ultimately really wants to play this. You can see by moving the rook here, by developing the knight here and the queen here, black wants to go c5 and open up the bishop. So placing a knight there is a really smart choice, because even if black takes, which is what they did, you end up having a pawn here, meaning this pawn can't push and this bishop is still stuck. We had the trade of rooks, a very nice sacrifice here by Magnus Carlsen. Instead of taking with the bishop and preserving the defense of this pawn, he took with the rook, allowing the queen to take here, which is what black did. Better was to go here, but this still doesn't really address the idea of the bishop. Here, you should theoretically try to go for something like a5 and maybe b4 and try to open up the bishop in some way, but it's still not that pleasant. But black took, which makes matters worse, because even though this pawn can theoretically push, now white does not give black that chance. They take and then infiltrate with rook d7. The bishop has to move to a8. Now the knight infiltrates. The pressure on f7 is too much. Black gives back the pawn. But even in this endgame, which seems totally equal, if anything, black has the 2 bishops. Shouldn't this be better? Well, it is not, and the reason for this is because this bishop is so out of play. While this one is really powerful, the one on a8 is doing nothing. Not only that, it's very hard and difficult for that one to get into the game. You know, paths like these, first of all, don't seem to do much, but even if this pawn pushes, it takes a lot of time, and white will try to strategically stop that from happening, especially by maybe pressuring this pawn with this bishop. And actually, let's just see what happened in the game. So bishop to c7, now the knight comes to c5 again, stopping the push. Then we see the bishop attacking the pawn pushes, and now the bishop comes to f3, fully stopping this bishop from ever having the ability to leave. But even if it could, I mean, the knight obviously is guarding the square. This is just full control over the position by white. Even though black has the 2 bishops, again, the 2 bishops doesn't mean that you automatically win. The bishops have to have some job in the position. They have to have some scope, and here that is simply not the case. We can see the kings starting to activate, and b4, incredibly instructive. If you move the knight away in this position, then maybe the bishop can try to escape, the king can try to defend this pawn, and the bishop tries to come into the game. But instead you go b4, and if the bishop ever takes, then the pawn here is stuck forever. And even though the bishop might try to escape here, that's going to take a lot of time. The king's going to come in, and it's just, again, a really messy position for black to be in. You never want to end up in this position from the opening. At least if you do, you want to always keep this in mind and try to do something about it. So a5, a3, not changing the situation. And in the end, black does take and try to activate the bishop, which I guess is the correct plan, but again, it's simply too slow. Black didn't prioritize this enough in the opening stage, and you can see them getting punished for it here. f4 here, and now a huge crime was committed with g4. You had to take here either. I mean, I don't think it really matters with what. We end up in this position, and even though white is maybe fighting for an edge here, trying to infiltrate. This is more or less going to be a draw because of the fact that the bishop did in the end manage to get in. But here, a second issue was created when the pawn was pushed to g4, because now not only has the bishop been trapped here for the last 20 moves, but now it's also trapped here. Black basically just put this bishop in a horrible spot for the rest of the game. And this is actually the move that lost Black the game, aside from this opening disaster that sort of happened. So f5, bishop to d7, and now f6, the pawn activating. Also a very instructive point. You might think, okay, f5, doesn't that also block in this bishop? And well, that is the case, but f6 was the idea, to give this bishop the way in. And so you can see Magnus really a nice strategical thinker. And unfortunately, it's just a horrible position. It's actually even some sort of funny zugzwang position because Black has no moves. h5 will just get targeted. And if you move the bishop anywhere, which is what happened in the game, then this pawn falls. We'll look at this in a second. And if you move the king anywhere, then suddenly you don't even have to push. You can switch the order. You can go here, a very nice touch. And after takes, you push and the pawn promotes. And if the king, let's say, comes here, then you, lose everything and it's simply game over. So, already here it's a huge mess, not much to do. And Black ended up giving away the pawn, after which the game was not too difficult for Magnus. He ended up getting his pieces back into the game and then controlling this promotion with this pawn. He's going to take it next, be up two very solid pawns, a very active bishop, and this bishop again still hasn't done anything useful in this game. You can see all the bishop has done is developed, gone to a8, gone back, gone here, 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 and that's about it. And so you need your bishops to do something meaningful. So that was game one, super instructive. Here's another one, Sergei Karyakin with the white pieces. And again, you can see the opening hasn't really gone in Black's favor. This is super theoretical, but from a strategical standpoint, this bishop is a little lost here. These pawns are really hurting it. This bishop is really powerful. Sure, maybe it, in some cases even develops towards this diagonal, but you want both of your bishops to do something. And after c3, knight c2, and h4, this bishop might not only be a target, but even if it escapes, which it tries to do via e7, it has nothing to do. The pawn here on d6 is totally blocking its scope. And so we can see how the game proceeded. You see the light square bishop coming into the game, but unfortunately the dark square bishop simply not. There was one instructive moment in this position. I think instead of the move rook to e8, Black could have played a4, which would have been a nice strategical concept, and we'll touch upon this after we look at the disaster that happened here. So noticing that Black square bishop, it's just not doing anything. The queen infiltrates, the rook infiltrates, everything happening on the queen side, and these knights are super powerful on the queen side. Same with this rook and queen. All of White's pieces have the mobility to transfer over to the side, and most of Black's, but hey, this bishop on f8, a horrible, horrible piece, and indeed, that is basically, again, what lost Black the game here. You can see a very beautiful knight b6. In this position, Black resigned. The threat of knight coming over to d7, attacking the bishop, attacking the rook, it is too much for Black to handle, and they resign. Now, I do want to quickly comment on one thing here, because we want to also understand, where did Black really go wrong? Because was it really the opening stage? Not exactly. This is a highly theoretical opening, and a lot of great players play it. It's not a horrible opening by default, but you need to know what you're doing. You need to play it with great care. And so what Black should have done was, in this position, after a5, knight to e3, instead of rook to e8, trying to open up this square, but even here the bishop's not really doing anything, Black should have played this beautiful move a4, freezing the pawns here, but also a very nice strategical concept to swing the bishop over here. When Black allowed White to play the move a4, this was no longer possible because, again, the bishop wouldn't have much to do over here, and the queen side is opening up. But here, instead, Black is closing the queen side, giving them time to maneuver their pieces, and opening up more scope along this diagonal. And, this could play out something like bishop d3, queen d7, and now bishop to d8, after which the bishop will develop somewhere. Of course, you're pretty happy to trade the bishop off for such a powerful knight here. But even if you don't want to, the bishop is simply better even on a5 in these sort of positions. And so an instructive point, I think, opening up the gateway for the bishop and closing up the structure to give the time for this bishop to maneuver over. And for a final example to really solidify this concept of the good and bad bishops, let's go ahead and look at this game here. Ali Ekin with the black pieces. And this one is really more about the endgame. We can actually even, well, already here, it's already quite apparent that this bishop is the one in question. You can see all of the pawns on the light squares, and same with the bishop. A horrible, horrible mess for black. And essentially what white did here was really smart. They just traded off all of the pieces. And you can see that just a few moves later, we get into this endgame where all we have left are the minor pieces, including this horrible bishop. More than that, white ended up trading off these two pieces to highlight the power of the knight, a very strong knight, versus such a stupid bishop on c6. And we can see this just in a moment. You can see here the trade happening. Now let's understand this endgame. The material is equal. The pawn structure is closed. There isn't that much tension, so it seems super safe and solid. But practically speaking, this is impossible to play. Objectively, I think the engine could hold this as black, but just about, and it's going to be a very hard fight. Because the issue is this bishop has no meaningful job aside from defending. That is why a knight in an endgame like this is so powerful. You can picture the knight on this square, this square, this square, or this square, all doing something meaningful. Whereas this bishop, try to find a good square for it. Even these squares here, it's not doing anything, it's not attacking anything. And that is the issue with having your bishop on the same color as your pawns. Not a good formula. So king b4, activating the king and then swinging the knight over. There was some shuffling around here. You're not going to win this game in 5 moves. It's going to take some time as well for white, but ultimately the knight comes over to the queen to the queen side, and knight to a6 was played here. The threat is huge, being knight to c5, where everything falls. The bishop moved here, allowing the pawn to be lost, but there was nothing to do. I mean, we can try to investigate something like king to c6 here. You can even perhaps go into this endgame and just claim that after the king activates, it's totally game over. Something like this. Notice opposition here, and also the fact that this king is much more active than this one. You're simply going to end up picking off some pawns, and with that the game here, actually the king simply has to part ways with e6. So that was the real issue here. So instead, black tried to keep the pieces on the board, but again, not the best pieces for black to keep on the board. And even though white ended up sacrificing a pawn here, a very nice move, you're going to see here f5, giving the king the ability to come in, the material is not the important thing here. That's what you have to understand. It's the value of these pieces. The bishop is not a three valued piece, if you will. The knight is more like a rook here. The bishop is more like a pawn in their value in this sort of practical scenario. The knight activates, and here black resigned because this pawn is lost and this is coming. These pawns are not going to be particularly safe either. It's just game over. So to summarize, you don't want your bishop on the same colored square as your pawns. You want your bishop instead to be working with your pawns, not against it. And there's many games, even at the top level, where failing to do this leads you to simply losing the game. And this is the sole reason that they lost the game. It's this strategical concept that they failed to understand. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you're new around here. Like this video if you did learn from it. And I will see you next time. Peace out.